Dale Calloway walked the upper field before sunrise on the first morning of July, the way he had every morning for 3 summers running, hoping the light would show him something different. It never did. The soybeans stood in rows that had gone the wrong color. Not the deep green of a plant that was drinking well, but the pale washed-out yellow-green that experienced farmers in Mason County read the way sailors read the horizon. Not a color, a warning. He pulled a leaf from the nearest plant, rubbed it between his fingers, felt the papery dryness of it, then let it fall. He stood in the row for a long moment with his hands at his sides, a man doing the arithmetic of a situation that kept coming up short, then turned and walked back toward the house without looking at the field again. The upper field was the worst of it, but not the only trouble. The corn in the middle acres was holding barely because June had insisted on a cover crop rotation 2 years prior that Dale hadn't been convinced of at the time, a decision he'd conceded with the muted grace of a man who didn't enjoy being argued into things, even when the argument was correct. The eastern fence rows had dried back further than any year Dale could remember. The pond at the low end of the property, a spring-fed basin that had supplied stock water for 3 generations of Callaways, was down 8 inches from its normal summer level. 8 inches of missing water. Dale had measured it against the wooden post his father had driven into the bank. In 1961, the graduations marked with a carpenter's chisel, and the water line sat 8 notches below where it should have been in July. Mason County, West Virginia, had entered its 3rd consecutive year of below-average rainfall, which in the language of the county extension office meant something measured in percentages in long-term averages, but in the language of the farms meant something simpler. The water that was supposed to come had not come, was not coming, and nobody with any credibility was promising it would come soon. The hills that rolled west toward the Ohio River still looked like hills green enough from a distance, the hardwood canopy holding its color, but the fields between them told a different story. You had to be close to the ground to read it. Dale Calloway was always close to the ground. He was 43 years old, deliberate in all things, a man who'd inherited 38 acres from his father at 26, added 4 more through a land purchase that had taken him 7 years to pay off, and farmed every one of them with the methodical patience of someone who understood that a farm doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to attention sustained over time, adjusted when the evidence demands it. He spoke in complete sentences when he spoke at all. He didn't complain about the drought to his neighbors because complaining about weather in Mason County was like complaining about gravity. It was what it was, it would do what it did, and the only useful thing was to figure out how to work within it. He came through the back door into the kitchen at 6:30. June was already at the stove, the cast-iron skillet sending up the particular smell of a farmhouse morning butter. Heat something browning at the edges. She had the radio on low, a weather report she'd already heard once. She turned it off without being asked when Dale sat down because June Calloway knew the precise moment when more information became less useful. She was 41 with the kind of practical capability that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. Her kitchen garden ran along the south side of the house in careful rows, tomatoes staked to cedar posts. She'd cut herself pole beans on a wire trellis. She'd built the spring before last peppers and squash, and 3 varieties of basil she grew from seed every February on the windowsill above the sink. The garden had survived the drought better than Dale's field crops because June watered it by hand every evening, carrying 2 gallons at a time from the rain barrel she'd positioned under the barn eave, a system of such unglamorous efficiency that it had delivered fresh vegetables to the kitchen table every week of summer for 11 years running. She didn't talk about it, she just kept doing it. Their 3 children came down in the usual order. Boone, first 15 years old already, the height of his father, though he hadn't yet grown into the width of him, coming down the stairs with the particular stomping deliberateness of a teenage boy who considered sleep a resource that had been taken from him unjustly. He poured his own coffee, a habit he'd started at 14 that Dale had decided not to fight, and sat at the table with the expression of someone who would engage with the morning once the morning proved it deserved engagement. Lottie came next, 8 years old, her brown hair in the loose braids she slept in, wearing the same faded blue shirt she'd worn 3 days running, because it had a small embroidered sun on the pocket that she decided she wasn't ready to stop wearing yet. She climbed into her chair, reached across the table for the butter without being invited to, and began arranging her silverware in an order that made sense to her. Nobody asked her about it. Wren came last. She was 11 years old, the middle child, and she came down the stairs differently than either of her siblings, quietly without the stomping or the distracted rushing her feet, finding the steps with the automatic precision of someone whose attention was already elsewhere. She was slight, but not small, her arms roped with the lean muscle of a child who spent genuine time outdoors doing genuine work. Her hair was dark brown, cut to just below her jaw in a practical line that she maintained herself with a pair of sewing scissors over the bathroom sink, a decision she'd made at 9 and never revisited. Her skin had been worked by 3 summers of West Virginia sun to the color of old honey. Her eyes were hazel greenish in outdoor light, brownish in lamplight, and they moved through a room differently than other people's eyes did. Not quickly, not darting. Slowly with a quality of inventory, landing on things and staying there. She came to the table with a small spiral notebook she kept in the back pocket of her jeans, set it beside her plate, and poured herself water from the pitcher rather than juice. She looked out the kitchen window at the upper field visible from where she sat for a moment before picking up her fork. Nobody at the table could have said exactly what she was looking at. She didn't announce it. She simply filed whatever she found and began eating. Iris Calloway came from her room off the back of the house at 7 o'clock, as she always did, moving, with the careful precision of a woman who was 81 years old and had made peace with the pace that required. She was Dale's mother, 5 feet 2 inches tall, with white hair she wore pinned at the back of her neck in a style she'd maintained since 1978. Dark eyes behind reading glasses she wore pushed down to the end of her nose, and the upright posture of a woman who had never permitted herself to hunch and was not starting now. She carried her own coffee to the table. She didn't let anyone pour it for her, which was a boundary she'd established when she moved into the back room 4 years ago, and enforced without drama by simply being faster to the pot than anyone else. She had a wire basket by her chair at the kitchen table that held the agricultural periodicals and extension service bulletins she'd been collecting since the early 1960s. She read them the way some people read novels, for the pleasure of the language, the precision of the technical detail, the accumulated understanding of a subject she'd spent her entire adult life adjacent to. When Iris was 22, she'd married Earl Calloway, who farmed. When Earl died, she kept the farming journals. This seemed to everyone in the family like a natural continuation of the same interest, though what she was actually doing with the accumulated technical knowledge was something nobody had thought to ask. Iris sat down, opened a 1967 bulletin from the West Virginia University Extension Service on subsoil moisture management, and read while she drank her coffee. She did not say good morning. Neither did anyone else. This was the Calloway morning rhythm, understood by all members as a collective agreement to let the day assemble itself without forced participation. Grady Finch came to the farm for the first time that season on the 3rd Thursday of May, which was 2 weeks before the situation in the upper field had reached the point Dale was willing to call critical, but 3 weeks after Wren had privately concluded it was already past that point. Grady was the Mason County Agricultural Extension Agent, 54 years old, with the steady, unhurried manner of a man who had delivered difficult news to enough farmers that he'd developed a professional cadence for it, thorough, honest, not unkind. He drove a white pickup with the county seal on the door, parked in the Calloway Drive, and walked the fields with Dale for an hour, while June brought out 2 glasses of iced tea that both men accepted without pausing the conversation. Wren was weeding the south fence row when Grady arrived. She did not stop weeding, but she positioned herself in the fence row closest to where the men were walking and listened to every word. Grady looked at the upper field with the same reading the ground attention that Dale used crouching once to press his fingers into the soil near the base of a soybean plant, bringing the dirt to his nose, rubbing it between his palms. He stood up and spoke plainly. The sandy subsoil in this section drains too fast for the rainfall you're getting. What comes down isn't staying long enough to matter. He looked at the slope. Your system doesn't have the pressure to push water up here efficiently. You're losing efficiency at the high end. Irrigate more frequently if you can manage the diesel cost. Mulch around the base of the plants to hold whatever moisture you do get. Dale asked about the economics of it. Grady was honest about that too. More frequent irrigation on the current system would cost more than the marginal improvement justified. The mulching would help, but not solve the underlying problem, which was that the field sat high enough above the water source that delivery was structurally inefficient with the equipment Dale owned. From the fence row, Wren had gone completely still. Not the stillness of a child who is hiding the stillness of a child who is thinking at full capacity. She was looking at the slope of the upper field, at the angle of it, at the direction the water ran when it ran at all. She was not looking at the crops. She was looking at the physics. Later that afternoon, when the house was quiet, Wren walked up the hill alone past the upper field, past the old fence line into the scrubby tree cover on the north edge of the property. She went to find something she'd noticed in April without registering fully: a shallow draw that formed naturally at the base of the ridge where the land cupped inward and the drainage from the slope above collected after rain. It wasn't a pond. It wasn't anything that had been named or used or considered. It was a seam in the geography that filled when the rain came and held what it caught for several days before the ground absorbed it or the sun took it. She stood at the edge of it, still damp from a storm 2 weeks prior, the soil darker there than anywhere else on the property, the grass around the rim greener in a way that was visible even in a dry July. She looked back down the slope toward the upper field. She took a piece of twine from her pocket and cut a length of it with the small folding knife she carried. She tied a stone to one end and held the other end level against a reference point she'd marked on a fence post the previous week when she'd first started mapping the slope angles in the notebook. She spent 40 minutes in that draw with a piece of twine, a stone, a section of wire, and a homemade plumb bob she'd assembled from materials in the barn. When she left, she had a number in the notebook: 9 feet 2 inches of elevation difference between the floor of the draw and the highest row of soybean plants in the upper field. She did not tell anyone what she'd found. Not that evening, not that week. She went home, ate supper, helped Lottie with her bath, listened to the screen door slap shut when Boone went outside, and sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had drifted away, filling pages of the notebook with diagrams that looked to anyone who might have glanced over her shoulder, like the kind of drawings a child makes when they're working something out. Mostly illegible, full of arrows. Numbers crossed out and replaced with better numbers. Iris passed through the kitchen for her 9 o'clock glass of water and looked at the notebook for one moment without stopping. She went back to her room. The next morning, there was a worn paperback on the kitchen table beside Wren's breakfast plate. A 1971 USDA Soil Conservation Service technical bulletin. Its spine cracked from repeated reading, titled, "With the kind of language government publications used when they wanted to sound useful. Low-pressure delivery methods for sloped agricultural land." No note, no explanation. Wren picked it up, looked at the cover, put it in her bag, and carried it to school in her backpack for 3 weeks, reading it during lunch in the section of the cafeteria near the windows where she sat alone by choice. The bulletin described drip irrigation in the specific technical language of 1971 Federal Agricultural Research: delivery of water directly to root zones through small aperture emitters operating at low pressure, reducing evaporative loss by removing the overhead delivery component, reducing runoff loss by concentrating the water where the plant's root system could access it before the sandy subsoil carried it away. It described the relationship between delivery pressure and emitter performance. It described in a section Wren read 4 times the concept of gravity-fed delivery using elevation differential between a water source and a delivery point to create head pressure without mechanical assistance. The math was straightforward. Wren checked it twice in the notebook with her own arithmetic. 9 feet of elevation created enough head pressure to run a drip emitter system across a 1/4 acre, assuming the pipe diameter was matched correctly to the run length, assuming the emitters were spaced at the intervals. The bulletin specified, assuming the collector at the high point was sealed well enough to hold the column of water without loss. She had the math. She did not have the pipe. She did not have the emitters. She did not have the fittings. She started asking for them the following Saturday. The first farm she stopped at was the Hensley place on Route 62, where a set of aluminum irrigation laterals had been rusting in the grass along the east fence line for at least 2 years. She'd noticed them every time the school bus passed. She leaned her bicycle against the Hensley mailbox, walked to the front door, knocked, waited. Gerald Hensley came to the door in his work boots and an expression of mild surprise at finding a child on his porch at 8 in the morning. She explained simply that she'd seen the old pipe and wondered if it was spoken for and whether she might take it if it wasn't. Gerald Hensley looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back into the house for reasons that were unclear then back at her. "Help yourself," he said. "You got a way to haul it." She showed him the wooden trailer her father had built for her 2 springs ago hitched behind the bicycle. Gerald looked at the trailer, looked at the pipe, and then with the particular expression of a man who has encountered something he cannot immediately categorize, said he'd give her a hand loading it. He did. When they'd finished, he leaned against the fence post and watched her bicycle back down the drive with the trailer rattling behind her. He called into his wife that evening and mentioned it, and his wife mentioned it to June Calloway at the post office the following Tuesday in a tone of affectionate bewilderment, saying she'd never seen a thing like it, a little girl in work boots collecting irrigation pipe, like other children collected baseball cards. June thanked her for the information, bought her stamps, drove home, and did not say anything to Wren about it. This was a deliberate choice, the kind that required more restraint than intervening would have. June Calloway had watched her middle child long enough to understand that Wren operated in a specific way, not secretly exactly, but privately. She worked things out in her own order, in her own time, and asking before she was ready to share produced nothing except a closed face and a shorter answer than the question deserved. June trusted the process more than she trusted her own impatience, which was its own kind of discipline. Wren spent every Saturday morning in June doing the same thing. She mapped the farms in a 5-mile radius from a county road atlas she'd found in the barn, circled the ones she knew had old equipment sitting unused, and rode to each one in a planned order that minimized backtracking. The farmers she approached ranged from mildly puzzled to actively amused. All of them said yes. Most of them helped her load. One of them, a retired farmer named Clarence Webb, who had 300 feet of deteriorating drip tape in his back shed, gave her the tape 2 cups of coffee he insisted she drink at his kitchen table, and a 20-minute lecture on the mistakes he'd made installing his original irrigation system in 1988 that Wren listened to with more attention than most adults would have given it, because 2 of the mistakes he described were mistakes she'd already identified in her own preliminary design. Boone watched the pile of salvaged pipe accumulate in the corner of the barn, where Wren had established her staging area, growing across the weeks of June into something that could no longer be described as a collection of oddments and was beginning to look like inventory. He said nothing for 2 weeks. Then one morning at breakfast, not unkindly, but in the tone of someone who has decided to go on record, "You know that's like 400 feet of pipe." He waited. Wren did not respond. Boone looked at Dale, who was looking at his coffee, then back at Wren. "What is it for exactly?" Wren turned to look at her brother with an expression that was not unfriendly and not informative. "The field," she said, and returned to her breakfast. Boone looked at Lottie, who shrugged with the committed sincerity of an 8-year-old who genuinely didn't know, but had decided her sister probably had a good reason. He looked at June, who was reading the back of a seed catalog with all apparent absorption. He looked at Dale. Dale was still looking at his coffee. After a moment, he said, "Pass the salt," to no one in particular. Boone passed the salt. The matter was for the moment closed. What nobody at the table knew, what Wren had not yet shared with anyone, including Iris, was the specific thing she'd worked out in the notebook. The seasonal draw on the north edge of the property was not a pond and had never been treated as a resource. It was a seam in the ground that filled with rainwater and held it longer than the surrounding land did, because the clay content of the soil at that particular point in the geology was higher than anywhere else on the property. A buried lens of impermeable subsoil that Wren had identified by pressing a steel rod into the ground at intervals across the draw and measuring the resistance at different depths. She'd done this with a piece of half-inch rebar and a wooden mallet over 3 afternoons in early June, recording the depth at which the rods stopped advancing easily into the ground at each point. The clay layer was consistent 4 to 6 inches below the surface, running the width of the draw. Water hitting the draw during a rainstorm would drain through the sandy topsoil, hit the clay and pool there invisibly from above, because the surface soil absorbed the standing water, but measurably because the moisture content at that depth stayed high for days after the surrounding land had dried. The draw held water. It sat 9 feet above the upper field. 9 feet of elevation routed through the right diameter pipe at the right run length was enough head pressure to operate drip emitters at the spacing the 1971 bulletin specified. No pump, no diesel, no moving parts except the water itself, following the physics it had always followed from high ground to low ground at the speed the pipe allowed. She had known this for 6 weeks. She had not told her father because she was not ready, and she was not ready because the gap between an idea that works on paper and a system that works in the ground is exactly the space where children get laughed at. She was not afraid of being laughed at. She was afraid of being laughed at before she had finished, because unfinished things could not defend themselves. The day she began building was the second Saturday of July, early enough that the air was still cool and the dew hadn't burned off the grass along the fence rows. She carried the first sections of salvage pipe from the barn staging area to the base of the draw before anyone else was awake. 3 trips with the bicycle and trailer, in the gray light, the trailer wheels leaving faint tracks in the dew-wet grass. Dale found her there at 7:30 when he came up to check the soil in the upper field the way he did every morning. He stood at the top of the slope and looked at his 11-year-old daughter crouching in the dirt near the seasonal draw with a section of PVC pipe and a hand trowel surrounded by irrigation components arranged in an order that made no immediate sense to him from a distance. He stayed where he was for a long moment. He did not call down to her. He watched her work for perhaps 5 minutes the way he watched the weather attentively without trying to change it. Then he went to the barn, came back with a long-handled spade, walked down the slope, and began digging a trench in the direction Wren pointed when she looked up and saw him. She did not explain what she was building. He did not ask. The trench needed to be 4 inches deep and run from the draw downslope to the first junction point, a distance of about 60 feet. That was what the work required, so that was what they did. The two of them digging through the dry July morning without speaking more than was necessary to coordinate the direction of the line. This was how Dale Calloway expressed trust, not through words, not through endorsement, but through showing up with a shovel and starting at the end that needed starting. Wren understood this about her father without ever having been told it the way children understand the operative grammar of their parents long before they have language for what they're reading. Boone came up the slope at 10 o'clock, saw the trench, saw his father digging, saw the pipe. He stood there with his hands in his pockets for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Then he went back down the hill. He returned with a second spade. He took the section of trench 10 feet further up the slope, past his father, extending the line toward the draw without a word. Lottie came at 11 carrying 4 water bottles and a paper bag with sandwiches June had made. She set them at the edge of the trench and sat down cross-legged in the grass to watch. Every few minutes she handed someone a water bottle without being asked because she had decided this was her role in the project and she was committed to it. The first system went into the ground over 3 weekends in July. Wren dug the collector basin by hand, a 4-foot square catch basin at the low point of the draw, lined with packed clay she carried in a bucket from the densest part of the draw bank, sealed at the outlet with a fitting she'd found in a box of miscellaneous irrigation hardware at the Webb farm. The main line ran from the collector basin down the slope in a trench that followed the contour of the ground, burying itself at 4 inches depth, the way the bulletin specified, emerging at the first junction point, where it split into 4 lateral emitter lines running across the slope at the spacing Wren had calculated from her row measurements. The emitter heads she'd bought at the farm supply store in town, spending money she'd saved over the spring from selling eggs, 22 emitter heads at 63 cents each, $13, and 86 cents total, $11 more than she'd had in April and $2 less than she'd had by the end of May. When the first system was complete, Wren opened the valve she'd fitted at the top of the main line and crouched at the far end of the run to watch. For 11 minutes, she thought it had worked. Then she walked the emitter lines and found what she found, and the number on the pressure gauge told her what the mathematics confirmed. When she ran them again that night, the system was losing head pressure across the run. The pipe was too narrow for the distance. The far emitters were receiving almost nothing. She sat in the dirt at the far end of the field as the afternoon light shifted and the pale soybeans around her caught the angle of it in a way that made them look briefly like something that might recover. They weren't recovering. They were doing what plants do in sustained drought, making rational decisions about where to spend the water. They had pulling resources from the outer leaves, concentrating what was left in the core, getting smaller and more interior, surviving in a technical sense while losing the capacity that made them valuable. Wren pulled her knees up and set the notebook on them. She did not write anything for a long time. Then she opened to a new page, drew a single horizontal line across it, the slope, the run, the distance from source to delivery, and wrote in the margin in small, careful letters, "The problem is not the water. The problem is the pipe." She had known all summer that the water was there. She had built a system that proved she was right about the water, even while it proved she was wrong about the pipe. Two true things at once. The answer was correct. The method was not yet. In the language of the 1971 bulletin, she had confirmed the concept while failing the implementation. That was different from being wrong. It didn't feel different sitting in the dirt with the pale soybeans in her peripheral vision, but she wrote it in the notebook anyway because she'd learned from Iris's pamphlets that the farmers who figured things out were the ones who were precise about the distinction. She spent 3 days taking the first system apart, not because it was beyond repair, but because she needed to understand each component's behavior under pressure before she rebuilt the way a person who has read a map wrong doesn't just correct the route, but goes back to the point where the reading diverged from the territory. The notebook gained 30 pages in those 3 days. Wren drew pressure diagrams at the kitchen table after supper, working through the arithmetic of head loss per 100 feet at different pipe diameters, checking her calculations against the formulas in the bulletin until she'd run each one 3 times and gotten consistent results. The core finding was unambiguous: 3/4-inch pipe lost pressure too fast over the run length she needed. The fix was architectural larger diameter pipe for the main supply line, which would hold the pressure column across the full run and deliver it intact to the lateral connections where the smaller lines took over. The bulletin specified the ratio step up at the source, step down at the emitter. She needed 1.25 minimum. 1.5 would be better. She had neither. She rebuilt with the material she had, stepping up what she could, resealing every joint, running the second system through a morning of cautious optimism. The water moved better than before. The first 2 lateral lines received adequate pressure, but the system bled itself out before it reached the far rows, not as severely as the first build, but enough to prove the problem was the main line diameter and nothing else. Grady Finch happened to stop by that afternoon, coming to check on the Adkins property nearby. He walked the system with Dale while Wren followed at a distance close enough to hear. He crouched at a mid-run emitter, held his palm beneath it, straightened up. "Pressure problem. She's losing it across the run." He looked at the slope at the pipe at the collector basin. "The idea is sound. The issue is supply line diameter." He gestured at the buried pipe. "Step up to a larger main 1.25, maybe 1.5, and the pressure equalizes across the run instead of bleeding off. Big pipe holds the column. Small pipe controls the delivery." He was talking to Dale. Wren had already written larger mainline, 1.25 or 1.5 inch in the notebook before Grady finished the sentence. That night she drew a new schematic with the corrected specification. The collector basin stayed. The emitter layout stayed. The root stayed. Everything that touched the ground between the source and the plant stayed exactly the same. What changed was the main line, a single pipe running from the draw to the first junction point that needed to be significantly larger than anything she currently owned. She'd used everything she'd managed to collect from 6 farms across Mason County. What she needed now was commercial-grade supply line, the kind that large vegetable operations used. It was Iris who mentioned Virgil Ames, not as a suggestion exactly, more as an item of information she'd been filing for the right moment. They were at the kitchen table after supper, the house quiet, Lottie asleep, Boone somewhere outside. Iris set down the extension service bulletin she'd been reading and looked at Wren over the tops of her reading glasses. Virgil Ames had a commercial vegetable operation on Birch Hollow Road until 2009. About 60 acres, tomatoes, peppers, some sweet corn. He was building a gravity-fed system for his far fields because the pump cost was killing him. She paused. He ran out of money before he finished it. The materials have been in his barn since. Wren looked up from the notebook. He won't be easy. Iris continued, picking the bulletin back up. Don't go expecting easy, but he's not closed. Wren wrote Virgil Ames Birch Hollow Road in the notebook, underlined it twice, turned to a fresh page, and began planning what she would say. She rode to Birch Hollow Road on a Saturday morning when the air was still cool, the bicycle trailer hitched behind her by habit empty. The Ames property sat behind a chain-link gate fastened with a padlock that was newer than everything else on the fence. The house beyond it was white two-story deep porch built in the era when construction was an act of permanence. The barn behind the house was original timber frame, enormous, the kind of structure that had accumulated authority the way old things did not, through appearance but through simple persistence. She leaned the bicycle against the fence, walked to the gate, called out once. Silence. Called a second time. A curtain moved in the front window, then went still. She stopped calling. She had learned from 14 Saturdays of approaching farmers with requests they hadn't anticipated that the people most worth waiting for were the ones who needed a moment to decide. She stood at the gate with a notebook under her arm, watched a pair of crows work the upper field visible beyond the barn, and waited. The front door opened 4 minutes later. Virgil Ames came onto the porch with the gait of a man whose left hip had been replaced and whose right was being managed on a combination of anti-inflammatories and stubbornness. He was 74, with a face that had moved beyond the category of weathered into something more absolute, creased deep, settled permanently, the face of a man who had stopped being surprised by the demands of any given day. He wore clean work clothes, old but pressed. He stood at the porch rail with one hand on it and looked at her with no expression she could read. She opened the notebook to the pressure schematic, the most recent version, with the diameter specification she needed, held it up so he could see it from the porch, and waited again. Virgil came down the steps. He walked to the gate with the careful economy of a man who didn't waste steps. He looked through the chain link at the drawing for a full minute without speaking. Then you drew that yourself. It wasn't quite a question. She told him she had. He unhooked the padlock. He didn't open the gate wide just enough. Come show me what you're building, he said, already turning toward the barn. The back half of the barn was organized in a way that suggested a man who had stopped working but hadn't stopped thinking about work. Along the back wall, on heavy wooden pegs, driven into the original timber at intervals, hung coiled lengths of supply pipe in multiple diameters. The largest ran along the highest pegs, 1.5-inch commercial grade, some sections still in the distributor, strapping, some cut to length. All of it in better condition than anything Wren had found in 6 farms of salvage, because it had spent 15 years indoors. Virgil didn't offer anything. He walked her through the space and waited while she looked. She explained the system to him the way she actually understood it from the ground up. The elevation of the seasonal draw, the rebar soundings that had revealed the clay layer, the specific measurement she'd taken with the weighted string, the pressure calculation from the USDA bulletin, the diameter ratio between main supply and lateral lines that would allow pressure to hold across the full 400-foot run. Virgil listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pointed at a number in the notebook. What's your assumed head loss per 100 feet? She told him, derived from the 1971 USDA bulletin, cross-checked against a formula in a soil science textbook she'd found photocopied inside one of Iris's periodicals, verified by running the calculation 3 separate times until all 3 agreed. Virgil looked at the number, then at the back wall. The silence that followed was not evaluation, it had weight behind it, the kind that came from a specific place. He had designed the same system. Not identical, his fields were different. The elevation differential smaller, the delivery area larger, but the same principle. Gravity-fed drip delivery, no pump sustained low-pressure output to root zones. He'd spent the winter of 2008 designing it, sourced the materials through a wholesale irrigation supplier in Charleston, broken ground on the collector basin in March of 2009. The bank had called his operating loan in April, before he'd laid a single section of supply line. The materials had sat on these pegs for 15 years. He turned from the wall. The terms were direct, the pipe in exchange for labor. His equipment inventory hadn't been formally cataloged since the operation closed, and he needed a written record of every component in the barn-type dimensions, condition, quantity. 2 weeks of afternoons. Each section of completed inventory earned the supply line components she needed for the equivalent section of her system. She agreed before he'd finished outlining the terms. What she hadn't accounted for was what the arrangement would cost at home before it produced anything in the field. Roy Bassett came by the Callaway farm on a Tuesday evening while Wren was at Virgil's barn working through the pressure regulator section of the inventory. Roy was 68, farming in Mason County since inheriting his father's land at 22, which gave him a kind of tenure authority that didn't require formal appointment. Dale respected him the way men respected people who'd weathered more seasons than they had. Roy stood on the porch and made conversation about the dry weather for the appropriate number of minutes. Then, in the tone of neighborly concern that is sometimes the least neighborly thing in the world, he mentioned that he'd noticed Wren going out to the Ames place regularly. He said Virgil Ames was a hard man, not bad, but hard, and there was talk. He said people saw a young girl going out alone to work for whatever she was working for, and they wondered whether her father had full knowledge of what she'd gotten herself into. He said he figured Dale would want to know what was being said. Then he left. Dale came to supper that night with an expression Wren recognized as something harder to address than anger, the expression of a man who'd been given a problem he hadn't asked for and couldn't put back down. After supper, when Boone had gone outside and Lottie had been sent to wash up, Dale asked Wren to sit at the table. He laid out what Roy had said without editorial. He described the community perception, how it looked, what people were reading into it, what it meant for the family's standing in a county where standing was built across decades. When he arrived at the conclusion, the words landed in the kitchen with the weight of a decision already made. I need you to stop going to the Ames place. Wren looked at the table surface. She let the silence hold for a moment, long enough to be real rather than reflexive. Then she looked up at her father and asked one question. Does your upper field have water in it right now? Dale's jaw set in the specific way it set when he was containing something rather than releasing it. Does Roy Bassett's upper field have water? She continued. Her voice was level, not challenging, not performing calm, simply factual in the way she was factual about everything. Does anyone in the county whose fields sit above their water source have water right now? The kitchen held that for a moment. June had turned from the sink to lean against the counter with her arms crossed, not inserting herself, simply present. In the hallway beyond the doorway, Lottie had gone completely still. She'd come back downstairs for the glass of water she always forgot after washing up, and she'd stopped when she heard the tone of the room. You stop going to the Ames place, Dale said. His voice stayed level through the effort of keeping it there. Whatever you need for the pipes, you find another way to get it. Wren went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the room she shared with Lottie, the lamp off the July evening light coming through the window in its last gray iteration. The notebook was in her hands. She had completed 11 of 14 required afternoons at Virgil's. She needed 3 more to earn the full set of components, 18 sections of 1.5-inch supply line, 14 couplers of the correct diameter pressure regulators, adequate for the full emitter run. All of it cataloged in her handwriting, waiting. She had built one system from salvage and it had failed. She had built a second and it had failed. She knew exactly why both had failed. She had found the material to fix it, negotiated access to it, begun the work to earn it. She was 3 afternoons away from the components that would let her build the system that worked, And the path to those 3 afternoons ran directly through a situation she hadn't caused. The feeling that arrived then was more precise than discouragement. The specific exhaustion of having been correct about something for months in a place where being correct wasn't a sufficient credential. She did not let it stay long. She got up, went down the hall to the back room, knocked twice, and waited. Iris was in the chair by the window with the lamp on the coffee cup cold beside her. She looked at Wren without surprise, as though she'd been expecting the knock. "Dad told me to stop," Wren said. She sat on the edge of the footstool near the window. "Roy Bassett came and said how it looked. Me going to Virgil's alone." She looked at the lamp. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just a kid making things complicated for everyone." Iris didn't offer the quick answer. She let the room settle. Then she told the story of Earl Calloway in the Western Field. Earl had believed in the fall of 1958 that the chronic spring flooding of the Western Field was caused by a buried clay layer near the surface, an impermeable stratum that prevented vertical drainage. The county extension agent had come out, looked at the field, consulted the regional soil survey, and told Earl the flooding was almost certainly caused by the field's position relative to the creek, not by subsurface geology. 3 neighboring farmers told Earl directly he was misreading the situation. One of them said so at a community meeting. Earl dug anyway. He spent the summer of 1959 installing a French drain system, working alone most days. People at the feed store chose their words carefully when he came in. The extension agent stopped visiting. The Western Field drained like no other ground in Mason County. It had drained that way for 65 years. Dale farmed it now without thinking about why, the same way a person drove a road without thinking about who built it. "People stop laughing once the thing works," Iris said. "The hard part isn't the laughter. The hard part is the time in between when you're not certain yet whether you're right, but you have to keep going as if you are." Wren looked at the lamp. "What if I'm not right? What if the bigger pipe still doesn't fix it?" Iris looked over her glasses with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much honesty the situation required. "Then you'll know 3 things that don't work," she said, "and you'll be 3 things closer to the one that does." Wren left the back room and went to the kitchen, where June was at the table with the farm ledger open, the pencil moving in the careful way June moved through the accounts every week. Wren sat across from her mother and waited until June looked up. "I need 3 more afternoons at Virgil's," she said. "That's all. Then I have everything for the main line rebuild." June looked at her for a moment, not the measuring look she used when she was deciding something, but the other look, the one that meant she'd already decided. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the notebook on the table between them. "Let me talk to your father," she said, and returned to the accounts. Whatever was said between Dale and June that night was never reported to Wren. What she learned were only its effects. Dale drove alone to Birch Hollow Road on a Thursday morning before Wren was awake, had a conversation with Virgil that Virgil later mentioned without characterizing, and returned home having modified his position. The new arrangement was never formally announced. It simply became operational. Dale would drive Wren to Birch Hollow Road for the 3 remaining afternoons. He would wait. He would not ask questions. He would know where his daughter was. This was the most Dale Calloway could extend in a situation that still made him uncomfortable, not because he doubted Wren, but because a man who lived inside a community understood that being right about a thing didn't exempt you from the cost of how you went about it. The 3 remaining afternoons at Virgil's barn had the quality of work done under a real deadline. On the final afternoon, when the last inventory section was complete, Virgil walked out to the truck while Dale waited behind the wheel with the window down. He set 2 additional sections of 1.5-inch supply line in the truck bed that hadn't been part of the agreed exchange. Wren looked at him. "Your junction calculation at the collector is short by about 8 feet, Virgil said without inflection. "Those cover it." He began turning back toward the barn, then stopped. He didn't face her when he spoke. His voice carried the weight of a man saying something true that he'd been holding for a long time. "The system I was building would have worked. I can see that now, looking at your numbers. I knew it then, too." He kept walking. Dale said nothing on the drive home. Somewhere between Birch Hollow Road and the farm, he reached over to the seat between them and picked up Wren's notebook, which she'd set there when she climbed in. He looked at the cover for a moment, not opening it, just holding it the way a man held something when he was acknowledging its existence without claiming ownership of it. He set it back down, right side up, exactly where she'd placed it. Boone was coming out of the barn when the truck pulled in. He watched Dale and Wren carry pipe sections to the staging area without speaking. He'd been in the house during the week of negotiation. He understood what the pipe was for. He watched the last section go onto the stack, then went back to the barn, came out with two sawhorses, set them along the staging area to support the longer pipe sections off the ground. He positioned them without consulting anyone, went back inside. No explanation, no acknowledgement that any was owed. Wren looked at the sawhorses. She pulled the notebook from her pocket and sat on an overturned bucket at the edge of the staging area, and she drew the final system schematic. It took 40 minutes. She drew it slowly, checking every measurement against the reference stakes still in the ground, from the first build, making the drawing match the land rather than making the land match a drawing. The corrected junction length. The new main line diameter stepping down to 3/4 at each lateral connection. The emitter spacing she'd settled on after 2 builds worth of evidence. She drew it once and got it right. When she closed the notebook, the soybeans in the upper field were still pale. The seasonal draw on the north edge of the property was invisible from the staging area past the tree line, in the shadow of the ridge, holding its water the way it had held it all summer. Patient in the way of things that didn't know they were waiting, which was the only kind of patience that never ran out. The third build began before dawn. Wren was in the upper field at 5:15 before the light had fully committed to the day, working by the beam of the headlamp she'd borrowed from the emergency kit in the barn. She'd laid out the new main supply line sections the night before, arranging them in order along the staging area so that the morning's work could move without interruption. The preparation was its own form of confidence, not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of someone who had learned twice exactly what went wrong when the details weren't held tightly from the beginning. The first thing she did was check the collector basin. It had been in the ground since July, sealed with packed clay, and it had held through 2 rain events without visible leakage at the outlet fitting. She crouched at the rim in the headlamp circle and pressed her fingers into the clay lining at the point where the outlet pipe passed through, checking for the softness that indicated seepage. The clay was firm, the fitting was dry. The basin had done its job through a summer of inattention waiting. She fitted the new main line to the outlet and began working down the slope. Dale appeared at 6:30 with the long-handled spade. He looked at the section of trench she'd already opened, assessed the direction and depth, moved to the point where her work ended, put the spade in the ground. Boone came at 8 with a post-hole digger for the compacted sections, having read the soil color well enough to identify them from a distance. Lottie came at 9 with water bottles in a canvas bag she wore across her shoulder, moving along the trench line with the serious efficiency of someone performing an essential function, which she was. By noon, the main supply line was in the ground from the collector basin to the first junction point, 215 feet of 1.5-inch pipe, the corrected length that incorporated Virgil's 8-foot adjustment, buried at 4 inches depth in a trench that ran straight down the slope's fall line. The junction manifold at the bottom of the main run was the component Wren had spent the most time on. In the design phase, a sealed manifold that received the full pressure column from the main line and distributed it to 4 lateral emitter lines running across the slope at the spacing the bulletin specified. She'd built it herself from salvaged fittings, sealing each connection with compound rather than tape, because compound cured harder and the manifold was the point in the system where pressure was highest and the consequence of failure was total. She fitted the lateral lines in the afternoon, unrolling the drip tape Clarence Webb had given her, cutting it to row lengths, connecting each lateral to the manifold, with the step-down fittings that reduced from the manifold's diameter to the tape's smaller aperture. Big pipe holds the column. Small pipe controls the delivery. She fitted the last emitter head at 4:15 and walked the full length of each lateral line one more time, pressing each fitting between her fingers, checking each emitter head for the click that indicated proper seating. 44 points of potential failure. She checked each one. Then she walked back up the slope to the collector basin, crouched beside it, put her hand on the valve, looked down at the system laid out below her in the late afternoon light, the barely visible line of the buried main, the 4 lateral tapes running across the rows of pale soybeans, The small black emitter heads seated at each plant's base and opened the valve. The water moved. She could hear it, a soft, pressurized sound from the pipe beneath the soil. The sound of a column of water finding its direction, filling the main line's volume from the source down. She counted past 11 minutes. She kept counting. At the 14-minute mark, she walked to the first lateral and crouched at the first emitter head. A slow, even drip fell from the aperture at precisely the rate the bulletin specified. Not a trickle, not a spray, not the faint moisture on plastic that the second build had produced at this distance from the source. A drip. Regular. Purposeful. She moved to the second emitter. The same. The third. The same. She walked the full length of the farthest lateral line, the one that had failed completely in the second build, the line where the pressure had equalized to nothing. She crouched at the last emitter head on the farthest lateral, the most distant point in the system. A steady drip fell from it into the dry soil at the base of a soybean plant that had been waiting for water since June. Wren sat down in the dirt beside it. She put her hand flat on the ground next to the emitter and felt the soil begin to darken under the drip. The color change that happened when dry earth received water. The shift from pale dust to something with depth, something that held light differently. She watched the circle of darkening soil widen slowly around the emitter head, the water spreading laterally through the root zone, finding the underground architecture of the plant's root system, arriving where the plant needed it without traveling through open air where the August heat would take it. She stayed there until Dale came to find her. He walked the lateral line toward her from the junction end. He crouched beside her without speaking, put his own hand on the soil, felt the moisture, pressed his fingers deeper to check the penetration depth. He stood up, walked to the next lateral and crouched there. Then the next. He walked the full system the way he walked things he needed to understand completely before he committed to a position on them. When he came back, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not pride exactly, because Dale Calloway didn't perform pride, but something more fundamental. He asked one question: how much water is this using compared to the pump irrigation? She told him. The number came out to approximately 38% of the volume the conventional overhead system used to deliver the same area. He was quiet for a moment doing the arithmetic. Then, you want to extend it to the east field before the season ends? She pulled the notebook from her back pocket. She'd already drawn the east field schematic. The soybeans did not change overnight. Wren had to learn that the system worked in the timescale of plants, not in the timescale of problems. She checked the field every morning, lying flat in the dirt at the end of each lateral to verify emitter output, walking the rows to read the soil color. On the fifth morning, she saw it. The leaves on the plants in the first lateral's rows had changed posture. Barely. The difference between a leaf angled slightly down from heat stress and a leaf that had found enough internal pressure to hold its plane. By the 12th day, the color had changed. The soybeans in the upper field were transitioning from the drought yellow that Dale had been reading all summer to something with more blue in it, a deeper register of green that meant the plant was photosynthesizing at full capacity. The pods that had been thin were fattening. The leaves that had been flat were turning their faces to the light at the angle of plants that had enough. Dale walked the rows on the 14th morning and said nothing for a long time. The neighboring rows outside the reach of the lateral lines, the same soybean variety growing under the same sky, in the same soil, were pale, thin-podded, the leaves beginning to curl at the margins from sustained heat stress. The rows under the drip system were a different crop. He stood at the boundary between the two sections and looked at the difference, the way he looked at things that required him to revise something he'd believed before. Virgil Ames drove out alone on a weekday afternoon without announcement. Dale met him in the drive. They stood together for a moment, two men who had never been easy with each other, finding the vocabulary of mutual respect that had been assembled quietly rather than declared. Virgil said he'd heard about the field. Dale said he could go up and look. Virgil walked the system alone without Wren spending 40 minutes up there by himself. When he came back down, Wren was at the staging area working on the east field pipe layout. He stopped and looked at what she was doing. She showed him the east field schematic. He studied it, then pointed at the junction placement she'd chosen. "You're going to lose 3 feet of head pressure at that angle," he said. "Move the junction 12 feet east, follow the contour there instead of the fall line, and you'll hold it." He looked at the notebook. You've got the math for it. She looked at the schematic. He was right. She made the correction. Virgil reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and produced a folded piece of paper, old or slightly yellowed at the folds. He held it out. She unfolded it. His original system design from 2008, drawn in the precise hand of a man who'd done technical drawing before computers made it optional. Different geometry from hers, but the same architecture, gravity-fed mainline, stepped down to lateral emitters, collector basin at the high point. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting added in different ink, a note to himself. System is sound, problem is time, not design. She looked up from the paper. Keep it, Virgil said. He looked at the East Field layout, then turned toward his truck. He spoke without stopping, his voice carrying the weight of a man saying something once and not again. What you built up there is what gets built when someone cares more about the problem than about being taken seriously. That's not a common combination at any age. He got in the truck and left. Roy Bassett's truck came down the farm road on a Saturday morning in the third week of August. He came the way people in Mason County came when they'd heard something they needed to see for themselves without announcement, in the posture of someone who was simply passing by. He walked into the upper field with the experienced, unhurried movement of 46 years of reading crops, stopped at the boundary between the irrigated rows and the dry rows, walked into the irrigated section. Crouched to look at pod development, pressed a finger into the soil to check its moisture. He pulled a pod from a plant in the middle of the third row, split it with his thumbnail, looked at the developing seeds inside. He stood up and looked at Wren. She walked to him across the rows and showed him everything. She walked him through the system from the collector basin to the farthest emitter, explaining each component in the plain language she used for everything, not simplified, not technical for its own sake, just accurate. She described the draw, the clay layer, the elevation measurement. She described the first two failures and what each one had taught her. She walked him to the farthest lateral and showed him the last emitter working its slow drip into the soil. Roy stood there for a long moment. Then he looked at Dale across the field. Something passed between the two men in that look, not an apology, because Roy Bassett wasn't built for direct apology, but an acknowledgement which in Mason County was the currency that mattered. Dale received it with the neutral expression he used when he was satisfied with an outcome, but not inclined to make a point of it. Roy looked back at Wren. Could you put something like this in on my north section? I've got a natural catchment up on the ridge I never did anything with. Probably a 12-foot drop to the field. She said she could look at it. The farmers came on a Saturday in late September, not organized, not announced, simply accumulating the way things happened in Mason County. Roy Bassett came first and brought his neighbor Carl Whitfield. Whitfield brought his son. Gerald Hensley came from Route 62. Clarence Webb came in his truck with the careful movements of a man who was 80 years old and had decided that 80 was not a reason to stay home from things worth seeing. They stood at the field's edge, these men who had given Wren their old pipe without knowing why, who had watched her load their discarded equipment into a wooden trailer and pedal away. The upper field in front of them was not the field they'd been watching all summer from their own roads. The soybeans stood at the height and density of a well-watered crop in a year that had produced no well-watered crops within the visible range of Mason County. The canopy was full, the leaves dark green, the pods heavy on the stems. The soil between the rows was dark at the surface, not wet, not saturated, but carrying the moisture of a field that had been fed rather than rationed. They walked in without being invited the way farmers walked into each other's fields. Clarence Webb crouched with the difficulty of his 80 years at the farthest emitter, put his hand beneath it. He stayed there for a moment. Then he stood, looked at Wren at the field's edge, and spoke with the directness of a man for whom the math had just finished. I've been farming this county for 58 years, and I gave you drip tape because I thought you were a nice kid who wanted it for some kind of project. I didn't know you were going to use it to grow the best stand of beans in the valley. The laughter that came from the men around them was different from the laughter that had come from porches in June. That laughter had been the laughter of bafflement, warm, not unkind, but dismissive. This laughter acknowledged something. It came from men who understood exactly what they were looking at and found it genuinely surprising, which was the rarest kind of surprise available to people who had been farming for as long as they had. Grady Finch came back to the Callaway farm in the first week of September this time, in an official capacity with a young man named Peters from the agricultural engineering program at Glenville State University, who was doing a field placement with the county extension office. They came on a Wednesday afternoon, Grady with his clipboard, Peters with a newer and thicker notebook than Wren's. Wren walked them through the system starting at the draw because the draw was where the logic started. She described the subsurface clay layer and how she'd identified it with rebar soundings. She described the elevation measurement and why it mattered. She described each design iteration, the first build, its failure, the specific cause; the second build, its failure, the specific cause; the third build, the corrections, the results. She described the winter performance questions she'd already begun researching, the freeze-thaw behavior of drip tape in ground that frosted the insulation approach she'd identified for the emitter heads at surface connection points. Grady listened. He asked one question when she described the system's water consumption. How does the per-acre water use compare to conventional overhead irrigation in your soil type? She told him. She'd calculated it from flow rate per emitter in daily runtime, 38% of the volume the conventional system used to deliver the same area with measurably better soil penetration at root depth, because the water arrived slowly rather than in overhead volume that the sandy topsoil shed before it reached the roots. Grady looked at his clipboard, then at Peters. What he said next was addressed to the young man from Glenville State. He spoke in the Register of Professional Instruction, which was the register in which Grady Finch said things he meant to be retained. I came to this farm twice this season. I looked at this field both times. I gave standard advice both times: more irrigation frequency, mulch for moisture retention. The advice wasn't wrong exactly. It was addressing the visible problem instead of the underlying one. He paused. This child found the underlying problem. She's 11 years old. Write that down. Peters wrote it down. The harvest came in the third week of October. Dale ran the combine through the upper field on a Tuesday morning, starting with the rows under the drip system, because they were ready first, the pods full, the moisture content at the right level, the plants standing straight enough to feed through the header cleanly. Boone ran the grain cart alongside. Wren walked the field edge, watching the combine work the way she'd watched water all summer, tracking the output, reading the evidence of the season and what the machine was pulling from the ground. The yield numbers came in that evening. Dale ran them against the field records. He kept going back 6 years, comparing this year's upper field against the same field in the same drought conditions. The irrigated rows had yielded 22% better than the farm's 3-year drought average for the same acreage. Not a miraculous number, not a transformation, a real number produced by a system that had cost 38% less water per bushel than the conventional method, built from salvage materials designed by a child working from a government bulletin published the year before her father started kindergarten. Wren had turned 12 in the first week of October, 4 days after the initial harvest estimates came in. The birthday had passed with the low-key acknowledgement the Callaway family gave to birthdays: June's cake, Lottie's handmade card, Boone's gift of a better folding knife than the one Wren had been using all summer to cut pipe tape. Dale had given her a new notebook, wider ruled than the old one with a harder cover. She filled the first 30 pages before the end of the month. The East Field extension went into the ground in the first 2 weeks of November, before the frost made digging impractical. It was faster than the upper field build had been, not because the work was simpler, but because everyone who'd been involved in the upper field build knew what they were doing. Dale dug without needing to be shown the direction. Boone took the compacted sections. Lottie managed the component logistics with an organizational system she developed herself over the course of the earlier build, keeping track of which fitting went where, with a series of labeled coffee cans she'd set up along the staging area that was more efficient than what Wren had been doing, though Wren would not have said this aloud. Virgil Ames came out twice during the Eastfield build, not to supervise, but to verify that the contour routing was performing the way he'd calculated. Both times he arrived unannounced, walked the partially complete system, made one observation, and left. Both observations were correct. Wren incorporated them without being asked whether she agreed. The January farmers' meeting was held in the Mason County Extension Office meeting room, which seated 40 and had 53 people in it by the time Grady Finch called the meeting to order. Wren stood at the front of the room with the notebook open to the system schematic and explained the project from the beginning. She spoke for 32 minutes. She used the language she used for everything accurate, direct, without simplification and without decoration. The questions from the room ran for another hour. Farmers who had catchments they hadn't used asked about minimum viable elevation differentials. Farmers with longer runs asked about extended mainline pressure management. The freeze-thaw question she'd anticipated came from three separate farmers in different forms, and she answered each one from the bulletin's footnote and from her own observation of the Eastfield system through the November frost. The emitter heads had required insulation at the surface connection points, discovered the morning after the first hard freeze when she'd checked the system and found two heads cracked at the fitting. She'd already designed a collar insulation solution and installed it on the remaining heads before the second frost came. Peters from Glenville State was in the back of the room, the newer notebook on his knee, writing continuously. Grady Finch closed the meeting. He said the Extension Office was preparing a summary of the system design for distribution to county farmers who wanted to evaluate similar applications on their own properties. He said the summary would credit Ren Calloway as the designer. He said the summary would note that the system had been developed with no formal training, no budget beyond egg money, no material beyond salvage, and had produced yield results that exceeded the farm's 3-year drought average by 22%, while using 62% less water per acre than the conventional system. He looked at her when he said it. She looked back at him with the hazel eyes that moved through a room, slowly landing on things and staying there. She was thinking already about the system modification she'd identified for Roy Bassett's north section, where the 12-foot elevation differential would allow a run geometry that the Callaway Upper Field's 9 feet hadn't permitted. 12 feet created options. She was working out how to use them. The pipe that had rusted along fence rows across Mason County was in the ground now, doing what pipe did when someone understood the system it belonged to. The water that had pooled in forgotten draws and ridge catchments was moving through it at the rate the land allowed. Arriving at root zones it had never reached before in fields that had learned one summer at a time what it felt like to drink. Ren Calloway was 12 years old. She had the east field producing Roy Bassett's north section designed Clarence Webb slope, surveyed Gerald Hensley's back 40, mapped in the notebook with preliminary elevation measurements taken on a Saturday in November when the air was cold enough to see her breath. She had Virgil's original schematic folded at the back of the current notebook, the one that ended with "System is sound, problem is time, not design." She was not short on time. She had the notebook, the draw, the pipe, the slope, the numbers, the work. She had Iris reading pamphlets at the kitchen table. She had Dale with his shovel present without requiring explanation. She had Boone taking the compacted sections. She had Lottie with the coffee cans. She had the problem, which was the drought, which wasn't going to end this season or the next. She had the answer, which was the water that was already there in the ground on the ridge, in the draws that nobody had looked at twice in 40 years of farming the same hills. The water had always been there. Someone just had to understand what it was.